So, Modular Foundation is committed to modifying the existing ISO 20022 data models so that they support the requirements of inclusive instant payment systems. Now, those of you who had any exposure to ISO 20022 will know that it was developed and retains the characteristics of large banks in the developed world and their requirements for payments. Our requirements are very different, and when we did an initial analysis, it was clear that the ISO, as currently constituted, was not suitable for us. However, it is the emerging global payment standard, and therefore we think it behoves us to make sure that it fits all of the payments that are going to be happening in the world. So the Modular Foundation has joined the ISO 20022 organization, and we are active participants, that's a new invented word, in the discussions. I have the honor to serve as the Modular Foundation's representative on the ISO 20022 discussions, which means that you can't even begin to imagine the number of dull meetings that I sit through. But it's okay. Don't bother showing your sympathy. Okay, so we're currently engaged with the ISO organization to decide on the best way of extending the specification to meet our needs. The problem is timetabling. Now, changes to the ISO 20022 specification are not speedy, especially when we're asking the ISO organization to make a few conceptual realignments, like stop thinking it's okay to waste customers' money and time, that sort of thing. So that's problematic. The earliest we can expect the changes we're talking about to be published as part of the ISO 20022 specification is the spring of the year after next. Now, obviously, that means we need to work around this. That's kind of intolerable for the sorts of timetables that we're talking about. So we made a proposal to the ISO organization. Basically, the revisions that we are currently discussing, we proceed as if they have been accepted, and our quid pro quo on that was that we agreed to revise our implementations if they turn out not to be completely aligned with the eventually accepted standard. Now, we are, of course, full of confidence that the organization will agree to our small and utterly reasonable proposals, and that therefore we won't have to make any subsequent revisions to implementations which assume the changes that we're talking about. This is an approach which has been agreed with the ISO 20022 committee that deals with payments. And that's all I'm going to say in general about that. I want to move on now to talking about the particular situation of ISO 20022 in relation to COMESA. And I want to use COMESA here as an example of something which I think we are going to face increasingly in the future, which is the question around linking schemes and schemes which use ISO 20022 with each other. Now, there are particular questions raised here, which I think, again, the ISO organization hasn't really begun to address, but eventually will need to. So the message itself in an ISO 20022, in a payments ecosystem, is only part of the overall ecosystem. Each message appears as part of an API definition, so that institutions can send the message through a modular loop system. So those of you who've been exposed to ISO messages already will typically have seen them as XML documents or indeed XML schemas, but that's just one representation. The ISO 20022 plan generally is that changes are made to an underlying data model, and there are automated processes for generating particular instantiations from that data model. One of those instantiations is XML, and the ISO organization is currently working to produce JSON from their underlying data models, which of course is going to be necessary if we're going to use them in API definitions. So the API structure is good. It enables us to verify each message is correctly structured. It enables us to verify that messages come from approved locations. And it also has a header which contains security information, in particular, the non-repudiation signature. There is an ISO initiative to do something like that themselves, but it's not totally suitable for our requirements, and it's not currently available for all messages. But ISO doesn't define at the moment what the header of a message should contain, and therefore we can continue to use the existing security and routing techniques without needing to change them while we switch over to ISO 20012 messaging. Now, looking at the background to these messages, it's a standardization approach, not a set of standards. It produces actual standards, but the underlying product is an approach. So ISO messages are developed to meet particular needs in the financial community. And typically, each message is extended to take account of all the additional uses that are required. So particular implementations will come back and say, no, we need it to be like this. The typical ISO response is, okay, well, we'll build a bit extra on the message to accommodate what you want to do. They are quite resistant, and organizationally, it's more difficult to invent new messages to meet particular requirements. So instead of a large catalog of specific messages with clear statements about what those messages are intended to do, we have those of you who've seen the catalog will laugh at me when I say this, we have a relatively small catalog of quite generalized messages, which are used in all kinds, or which are designed to be able to be used in various different contexts. So each message then has a small number of required fields and a very large number of optional fields to take account of the various ways in which that message might be used in particular payment systems. And any given implementer, and this is particularly true of us, will typically require a subset of the available fields in any ISO 20022 message. A lot of the stuff will just not be interesting or useful to the way in which we want to define payments messages. And that's not because it says anything special about Moduloop. Every implementer will be removing bits that they don't need to use. And typically, any implementer will also make some optional elements in the specification mandatory for their implementation. They will say, if you're going to use the messages in our implementation, this stuff has to be there because we need it because of the way our system operates. Now, we have relatively modest ISO 20022 requirements. We require a small subset of the available fields because we don't use or need the rich array of agents and proxies which messages currently support. Don't forget they're designed for passing through numerous institutions, agents, proxies, sub-agents, other agents. And the ISO approach has been to include information in the body of the message about each type of agent or proxy who might be engaged in the long and tedious journey of payment. We are typically, the people who we want to support are typically much simpler entities than the large and complex commercial entities which the messages were originally developed to support. That's not to say that the requirements are any less important, but typically one of the things that we've tried to do in the Moduloop community is to simplify the messages to get back to the basics of what payments are about so that small and relatively informal institutions can implement them successfully. And ours are direct transfers, which are cleared immediately. That's one of our fundamental points. So an awful lot of information which is needed if you're planning to clear at some point in the future and settle at some point after that doesn't need to be included in our messages. So we want to be clear about our purpose. We're specifically designed to implement in jurisdictions where customers are poor, they can't tolerate failed payments, they can't subsidize inefficiencies in their payment system. The average size of payment that we target is about $1, so running costs must be at a minimum. And one of the biggest problems with the ISO messages at the moment is that they are simply designed to be thrown out into the ether, and they may complete at some point in the future, but there's no obvious way of telling whether that's the case or not, and still fewer ways of telling where a message is in a particular process. Has it been rejected by one of the agents? If so, has the agent bothered to tell anyone else? Is it just waiting for something to complete somewhere? It's very hard to tell, which is intolerable for us. Ooh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So we've got to be able to support high throughput at low cost. So all of the payments and the settlement as well have got to be automated. Now, as if that's not bad enough, there isn't just one ISO 20022. They're designed to be flexible, as I've said. So messages which are accepted in one payment scheme may not be accepted in another payment scheme. Now, this comes back to the point I started to raise earlier. ISO messages, broadly speaking, are implemented in single systems. An example is European TIPS, which is the European Instant Payment System. That uses a single specialization of the set of ISO messages. And if you want to join TIPS, you have to use those messages, or you have to use the messages in that way. But if you're from outside TIPS, you can't transact with it anyway. So there you go. It's a single scheme plan. There are accepted methods of specializing the messages. There's a market practice document, which is a document that the scheme writes that says, here is how we plan to use the messages. The Swift one, I think, is about 150 to 200 pages long. There is what's called supplementary data, which is really the ISO version of the extension fields that we use. You can specialize it. It's more flexible than the extension fields that we use, but that requires approval from the ISO organization, but it's relatively easy to achieve because all you're saying is, this is a specialization for my particular scheme. And finally, there's the slash and burn. Now, the slash and burn approach says you just take the schemas as they're produced and you manually edit them so they do what you want. The problem is, where these things are adopted, there's no guarantee that they are known to the ISO authority. One of the complaints one occasionally hears from people in the standard setting area is that they really have no idea what people are actually using these messages for and how they've modified them in order to do the things that they want. Now, the point of standardization, at least as far as I understand it, is to remove the need for detailed point-to-point transformations between systems. The sort of thing that, remember Min was talking the day before yesterday about the cross-network provider. That's what it does. It does a point-to-point transformation between different standards. The problem that we have is that the current situation is in danger of reintroducing these point-to-point mappings through the back door. So people are saying, okay, we're using ISO 20022, but when you scratch the surface, you'll find that incompatible versions of ISO 20022 are being used. And one of the challenges for the COMESA project is to find a way in which each of the national implementations of ISO 20022 and indeed each of the participant implementations of ISO 20022 are compatible with each other, such that a message can pass from a participant in one scheme to a participant in another scheme through the COMESA scheme without needing to be modified in any way. That's our objective. And it's not, I fear, going to be a simple one to achieve. Okay. So as I've said, we will need to agree on a series of message formats that will satisfy all the parties. They will be specializations of the existing ISO 20022 messages. I want to propose also as an objective for us that we should not extend the messages further than the ISO specification itself, that we should not, for instance, use supplementary data, anything like that. We want it to be, I think, a specialized version of the ISO specification itself. Because again, one of our objectives eventually will be that someone from, well, I don't know, where should I say? Someone from Zambia who happens to be working abroad in France, let's say, or the UK or the US, their organization, their bank in the US can send an ISO message requesting a payment to the COMESA scheme, and it can be accepted and processed there. Subject, of course, to all sorts of caveats. But in principle, that again is the objective we want to get to. That's the point of standardization as far as we're concerned. At the very least, those banks in the developed world should have some reference where they can go and say, okay, well, if I'm proposing to route payments to Zambia, what do those payments have to look like? And they can understand that and decide whether or not they're going to support payments through that corridor. Now, we have a detailed plan for deciding which ISO messages need to be used in which modular loop contexts. And by modular loop contexts, I mean the endpoints that say things like resolve an address, agree the terms for a transfer, execute a payment, those sorts of things. We have a reasonably detailed plan for mapping the existing modular loop API messages onto ISO fields. We've been through that in reasonable detail, and we're sort of happy with it. We are proposing extensions to the standard where we think those are necessary. And some of those will be changes to existing messages. And in particular, there will be new messages to cover, first of all, the agreement of terms, which is a concept that ISO 20022 has never heard of. And second, possibly to, actually, it's not true. We won't be using new messages. Sorry, forget I said that. Now, the ISO process, as we've said, is painstaking. So what are we going to do? We've agreed the structure to cover the requirements of the POC and the initial implementation. And I'm going to talk through that in a little bit of more detail in a moment. We'll work towards agreeing this with all of the COMESA participants as part of the POC. And we'll work with CBC to produce a report proposing how to implement ISO 20022 as one of the outputs from the POC. Initial POC will use the existing endpoints. Participants will use existing core banking system functionality, and they will be implementing an adapter, thanks to the magic fairy dust of FitserWorks, which will convert those inputs from the core banking system format to the modular loop format. When ISO 20022 is implemented, we can simply swap the adapters. The participants themselves will not require making changes to their core banking systems. We can just put an ISO 20022 adapter in place of an FSP-IOP adapter. At least that's our proposal. And any final changes, as we said, can be implemented at a later date. So what endpoints do we need to satisfy in the first instance? Well, first of all, there's address resolution. We have to be able to send a request that says who owns this phone number, and we have to be able to get a response that says this institution, and here is their name at the very least. We need agreement of terms. It's a fundamental part, as we keep saying, of the modular loop system, that the terms for a payment are agreed before any funds are moved. We need that both for payments and for currency conversion. We need to execute payments for payments themselves and for currency conversion. And we need to be able to settle. Those will be ISO messages, but they're not very interesting to us at the moment. So each endpoint will require a request response because our API is an asynchronous one. When someone sends a message to a participant, the participant does a brief check for compliance with format, and then responds saying, I will get back to you. And the response comes back on another message, not the message that was originally sent. So looking at payments and currency conversions, we need to make a PVP currency conversion per transfer. We've talked about that earlier on today. They need to go through the same agreement of terms as a payment. Our plan is to treat them as if they were liquidity transfers, which is essentially what we think they are. And there is a set of ISO messages or a pair of ISO messages that currently used to define liquidity transfers rather than payments themselves. Address resolution. We're requesting an address resolution in our world is a get without a body. So we don't need to worry about an ISO message for that. There is no content. The response will be you're going to see a bit of these ISO message definitions. ACMT 024, we don't think any changes are required to that. We can simply use it. Agreement of terms. Now, we've had discussions in the evaluation team in ISO 20022. We originally proposed, on the advice, I have to say, of the ISO, that we should distinguish the agreement of terms from the execution of a payment by having different states of the same message. It turned out people didn't like that. They thought it would be better to have a new message or a new pair of messages covering the agreement of terms. So for the moment, we're going to assume that there is a new message, that those messages will form part of the PACS, Payments Clearing Settlement message set, and that their content will essentially be analogous to the existing payment execution request. Unsurprisingly, since the terms that are being agreed are the terms of the payment. But that will mean that we shouldn't have to do a great deal of definitional work in order to implement this. We should just assign new messages, PACS 030 for the request and 031 for the response, but they could be anything, to be honest. Payment execution. Request will be a PACS 008, which is an existing message that's used to say, please execute this payment. Request for a currency conversion, as I've said, is a request for liquidity, and that is currently a PACS 009. The content of the message is roughly the same as that of a PACS 008, not completely, but roughly. But the purpose will be understood by participants in an ISO message system. And again, we will assume that the modifications that we're currently talking about are accepted in their proposed form, which is adding a cryptographic lock to the credit transfer definition, adding an expiry time to the payment execution request so that we can get I'll rephrase that, so we can get a deterministic answer for each transfer, and we don't wind up in the current ISO stage where transfers are hanging around for days without anybody knowing whether they've succeeded or failed. And we will probably want some further definition of transaction type. Now, the existing motor loop transaction type is quite a complicated structure. ISO currently, like a lot of other systems, just uses a text tag, which says things like B2B, P2B, G2B, those sorts of things. So we'll need to do a bit of extra mapping to get those fields sorted out. And we will need some additional external codes because they don't cover all of the things that we currently do. But the number of changes, I think, we've got to a position where they are surprisingly little. Thanks, and I have to say, thanks to the good advice we've got from the ISO 20022 specialists in the evaluation team, who in a number of cases where we said, we think we need a new field for this, they said, oh no, you're mistaken. Actually, it's this field which is supposed to contain that information. So response to a PACS 008 or indeed 9 will be a PACS 002, which essentially gives the status of a payment. But for us, we will need to add a cryptographic key, which corresponds to the cryptographic lock, so that we can do the switch, and the receiver, the debtor institution, will be able to verify that the response is a correct response and that it came from the right place. So that really is just a summary of that. And that brings me to my end. Goodness me, Miller has a question. Hmm?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for that good presentation. And I have one question in respect to the ISO 222 in the context of COMESA. So looking at the detailed plan, and also even in terms of the current project plan that is there in as far as COMESA Business Council is concerned, I would just like to have maybe a tentative idea as to probably how long will this going to take, taking into account also the time frame of August next year. Are we going to be in track in as far as doing all this? Like, for instance, you talked about specialization of existing ISO 222 messages, but also maybe a need to agree on a series of message formats which will satisfy all parties. Thank you.
Thank you. Which gives me an opportunity to say that I'm happy to say that our highly trained and motivated team in the shape of Fitzgerald and Lex Stego have already prepared a questionnaire on the use of ISO 20022 in the existing national schemes and also for distribution for the participants. Once we get the results from that, we will be in a better position to say how difficult this task is going to be. But until we know what people are currently doing, and indeed what they're proposing to do, it's hard to say in advance what sorts of changes will be needed. I am hoping that we will be able to wind up with what I might call a loose federation, where not every national scheme is using exactly the same fields, but where there is agreement on the core fields relating to a payment. Core fields relating to a payment, and therefore messages can be passed between the jurisdictions without needing to be modified. Miller.
A couple of quick ones. The first, I think you may have answered, but it wasn't super clear. In the presentation, you said you rely on specialization, but not extension of existing messages, which seems intractable to me. We have to add ILP message type fields. We have to add cryptographic signatures in ways that are not anticipated by those fields uses within the existing message set. That would suggest at least some form of extension, unless you're intending to specialize fields that were left open to any use. That's first one. I'm going to
let me answer the first one before you go on to the second one, and that will avoid us having to consult the Oracle, who is not taking notes at the moment, I think, in order to remember what the first one was. So my answer to the first one is, you're completely right. This is a misspeaking on my part. We are going to extend the actual messages in the ways that we need them to be extended to handle the things that we want. What we're not going to do is to make use of the various temporary forms of extension which ISO provides. So again, it's a policy point that we made very early on. We're not going to add bits that are specifically modular loop. We think that these things are important. We also think that in the future, when they get round to having to provide a better service, all financial institutions will have to work in this way. And therefore, we think actually they should be thanking us for getting this stuff sorted out now.
All right.
Second question.
So that follows back to your original statement of we're going to act as though they approve of our changes and then we'll revise when we get around to it.
Yeah.
But that these things would be done in a way they're not special to us. They would be done in a way that we could then specialize them in our
Absolutely.
ways. Okay.
Yeah.
The second is, have you compared our mappings to what Nexus is proposing to do? Because they will presumably have a liquidity call and some other things they need to put in. Is there any commonality between what we're proposing to do and what Nexus is doing, or is it just not?
There isn't a great deal of commonality
Okay.
because the Nexus, so Nexus does use ISO 20022 messages, but they basically have sold the pass. Essentially what they've said, sorry, they've sold the pass. What they've said is, where we can use an existing ISO 20022 message, we will. Where we can't, we will use a Nexus message.
Oh, yeah, a Nexus meaning some random thing that they've made up that's not part of the ISO spec?
You might say that.
Well, gosh, if they can get away with it, why can't we? Sorry, that was out of.
Because we want to be able to hold our head up high in the standard world and not go sneaking about like people who gave up at the first hurdle.
Okay, thank you.
Next
So really,
question, please.
it's really not it would be inappropriate for us to match the direction that Nexus is going in their current strategy, which is to essentially ignore differences that aren't supported by the ISO standard to just make progress. Whereas we've taken the approach to actually modify the standards in a holistic way so that we can specialize them for our uses then. Is that fair?
It is completely fair.
Thank you very much.
I expected no other. All right. Any more questions, comments? Simeon's saying, no, you can't, but if anybody wants to. No? Okay, in that case, thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Round of applause.